Hey guys, tonight we slide under layers of gauze-thin silk into a room faintly lit by lanterns shaded in red, where sandalwood smoke curls in the air like a secret being whispered. You're in a Tang Dynasty chamber, maybe in Chang'an maybe, deep in the forbidden inner quarters, but what matters is the bed, the wide, lacquered platform with silk brocade sheets still warm from someone's skin. There's a sound, not footsteps, not moaning, not quite. It's the quiet murmur that comes after, the kind of whisper that decides empires. Pillow talk, you've probably done it. Or tried to, but not like this. Not with national budgets and arranged assassinations folded neatly between compliments. Not with coded poetry, not with eunuchs listening on the other side of the wall. Not with incense timed to burn down precisely before anyone says something they can't unsay. No, your D-Miz will never hold this much weight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and local time in the comments, just so I know who else is lying awake tonight, wondering what it means that entire dynasties could hinge on a lover's sigh. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not walking through history tonight, you're sliding into its sheets. The Tang Dynasty 618 to 907 C isn't just an age of poems and plum wine. It's a time when eroticism is an art, and intimacy is more dangerous than battle. Pillow talk here isn't just sweet nothings. It's surveillance, it's strategy, it's spiritual invocation. You're lying beside women and men trained to seduce, yes, but more importantly, trained to listen. You're whispering secrets you didn't even know you had, and when morning comes, someone might be dead, promoted, exiled, or pregnant. Maybe all four. Picture it. A courtesan's chamber. Window lattice open just enough for moonlight to slip across the floor like spilled milk. Your head rests on a porcelain pillow, unforgiving, but beautiful, painted with lotus blossoms. A fan lies beside you, still damp with perfume. The woman next to you has not just memorized verses from the classic of the inner chamber. She's edited them in her head, improved them, weaponized them. She's stroking your chest absentmindedly while asking about your cousin's new military post. Is that affection or espionage? Her breath is sweet with osmanthus wine. Her hand, curious but calculating. You feel like you're seducing her. You're not. She's 6 moves ahead. She already knows what you'll say before you do. She's heard it from 3 other men this week. You don't know she's writing a poem in her head. It'll be famous one day. You'll be in it. But not as the hero. C. The Tang elite didn't just lie together. They spoke together. And that part? That's what we've lost. The lost art of pillow talk. And not just any talk, but a coded, emotionally rich, politically charged form of communication that could soothe jealousies, build alliances, even spark rebellions. Intimacy in this world is choreographed like a court ritual. Timing is everything. So is posture, tone, and that well-timed pause where you almost confess to something. But don't. There's a reason Tang poetry is soaked in longing. Why the love stories always end in exile, or mist, or a phantom drifting through peach blossoms. Pillow talk is never just between 2 people. There's always a ghost in the room, a past lover, a potential rival, the empress herself. And somewhere, beyond the screen, a eunuch is scribbling down what he hears. Because yes, many of these sessions were transcribed. Not for pleasure, but for power. So much so that lovers began coding their confessions inside metaphors. A lotus wasn't always a lotus. A crane flying south wasn't always about birds. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Not emotionally, not reputationally. You'll fall in love with someone who disappears in the 3rd act. You'll get too comfortable and say the wrong name. You'll think you're being clever, but your metaphor is one the empress herself once used, and now she thinks you've betrayed her. All of this will happen while you're still naked, still half drunk, still pretending this is just about pleasure. It never is. In the Tang Dynasty, love is a full-time job. A woman's voice, especially in bed, could influence appointments, dissolve marriages, trigger reforms. A concubine with a well-placed word in the emperor's ear could save a province or bury it. And the men? They didn't always have the upper hand. Pillow talk is the one battlefield where hierarchy sometimes reverses, where a low-ranked woman can steer the fate of generals, or where a poet, charming and broke, can find himself suddenly appointed to the palace, not for his politics, but for how he sighs after sex. Let's get this straight. We're not here to gawk. We're here to understand. To reimagine what intimacy used to mean. To realize that there was a time when sex wasn't the climax, conversation was. The Tang didn't see words as foreplay. They saw them as the point. Everything else, touch, scent, skin, was just scaffolding. The real act was what happened after, in the dark, on a pillow. Between two breaths. Tonight we're going to lie beside emperors, concubines, monks, poets, spies. We'll listen, we'll learn, we'll laugh, sometimes nervously. Because honestly, it's awkward, and beautiful, and weirdly familiar. And by the time we reach the last whisper of the last dynasty, maybe, just maybe, you'll rethink what you say after the lights go out. You're still lying there, tangled in sheets that cost more than a small village's yearly taxes, trying to make sense of how much power can fit between two breaths. Now let's inch closer to the bed of Emperor Xuanzong, the guy who doesn't just change lovers like robes, but policies too. By the time you make it to his chamber, you realize this isn't just some emperor indulging his libido. This is statcraft, erotic statcraft. Xuanzong doesn't need a spy network when he has pillow talk, and he doesn't need a prime minister when he has Yang Gaifei curled beside him, her cheek resting against a hand that once crushed a rebellion. With a single flick of a jade ring, it's hard to overstate how intimate governance becomes under his rule. Council sessions start late because he's still indisposed, which is Tang code for lying around with. Yang discussing border patrol budgets and whether that general from the north is looking too ambitious. You think it's gossip until you realize 3 provinces are being redistributed while she plays with his hair. Historians still argue whether Xuanzong genuinely loved her or just found her politically useful. But that's the thing about Tang-era intimacy. You never really know where emotion ends and strategy begins. What's even more dizzying is that these nighttime chats aren't just impulsive passion spills. They're often rehearsed, stylized, delivered in poetic couplets. Yang wasn't born royal, but she studied like hell to pass the bedroom exams. Not just beauty and dance, but the subtle science of emotional manipulation. You see, being a favored consort was less about sex and more about conversation. She had to hold her own in philosophical debates while knowing when to look adorably confused. She had to praise Xuanzong's poetry, bad poetry, without sounding fake. She had to mention tax reforms like they were sexy. And she did, effortlessly. So now as you lie there in your imaginary silk, you start to realize seduction in the Tang court wasn't just about pulling someone close. It was about making them feel heard, valued, influential, all while being exquisitely aware of where the nearest eunuch might be listening. Speaking of eunuchs, remember, nothing said in bed stays in bed. Not here. The Emperor's sleeping quarters are a leaky ship, and the crew is paid in secrets. It's widely believed that some eunuchs even kept their own logs, literal pillow diaries, detailing which consort said what about whom, especially if the information could be useful later. Xuanzong knew this. That's why his most intimate moments often doubled as diplomatic meetings. Why waste daylight hours when your partner's already emotionally invested, legs draped across yours, wine fogging their judgment? And it worked. Entire military campaigns were proposed in whispers. Generals were dismissed over postcoital pillow frowns. Even foreign policy took shape under gauzy canopies. Tang China wasn't just run from the throne room, it was steered from the bed. Let's not pretend this was all clean. One story, suspiciously underplayed in official chronicles, involves a junior concubine who once suggested in bed that Xuanzang should audit the salt tax system. The next day, a full investigation began. The week after, she was quietly promoted. Coincidence? Not likely. Pillow talk here was a shortcut through bureaucracy. You didn't need to storm into court. You just needed to snuggle, but you also needed to be precise. Too casual and you'd be seen as meddling. Too forceful and you'd be labeled manipulative. The trick was to sound like you were concerned, not political. To fold your suggestion into a story about a dream or a memory of a relative suffering in a border province. The art lay in not letting him realize you were steering the ship until it had already changed course. And yet, there's a tragedy here. For all his whispered power plays, Xuanzang's reign doesn't end in a golden haze. It ends in rebellion. Yang Gefei, the very woman he once trusted above all others, becomes the scapegoat for the empire's decline. His ministers blame her, his army rebels, and she is sentenced to death. There's a legend that Xuanzang hesitated, tried to hide. Tried to save her, but in the end, he lets her die. Maybe he had no choice. Maybe he did. Historians still argue whether he wept for love or for losing his favorite political chess piece. What's certain is that their final conversation, whatever it was, is lost. No eunuch transcribed it, no poem preserved it, just silence. A final, irreversible hush between two people who once ruled an empire from bed. So now, as you turn your imaginary head on that hard porcelain pillow, you start to wonder what your own bedroom conversations might be worth. Not in a sexy way, necessarily, but in terms of power, influence, trust. Can you shape someone's decisions with a sigh? Have you ever felt the exact moment a person became vulnerable enough to listen, really listen, because your skin touched? Theirs, the Tang knew. They exploited it. And maybe we've forgotten it. Or at least, downgraded it to lazy Netflix murmurs and half-met I love yous. But not here, not in this bed. This is where empires are made. Where soft voices echo loud enough to shift borders. And one more thing, just because this is bedtime. And we all deserve a weird historical footnote. Sex with royalty wasn't always private. There's a half-believable account of an early Tang emperor who required his favored consorts to recite verses aloud during sex verses about the loyalty of officials, or the virtue of tax reform. The man was turned on by metaphors about civil service. You can't make this up, or maybe you could. Either way, the intersection of power and pillow talk in the Tang Dynasty wasn't just intimate. It was institutional. You're still sprawled in that afterglow of Tang intrigue, tangled not just in sheets, but in layers of silk-thin schemes. This time, the air shifts faintly citrus with a sharp undertone of something metallic, like ambition. Dressed up in perfume. You're in the women's quarters now, where beauty is political currency and survival depends on how well you smile while calculating someone else's downfall. A concubine isn't just a lover, she's a strategist, a stylist, a poet, a psychologist. You think she's fixing her hair, but she's actually repositioning power. Every flick of rouge is a campaign. Every stroke of ink on her fan is an encrypted message. This is cosmetics as combat. Welcome to the real royal court, where the throne is just the background set piece, and the real chessboard lies in a single glance across a silk-draped room. You're watching women wives, concubines, entertainers move like generals, their battleground the emperor's favor, their weapons hidden in poetry, fashion, and yes, the most devastating instrument of all, casual conversation at night. The emperor's body might be tired from ruling, but his mind? Still pliable, still receptive. That's when they strike. Not with a sword, but a suggestion. Not with poison, but pillow talk. You think it's just flirtation until you realize she's building coalitions with compliments. One consort praises another's embroidery too loudly, and suddenly that girl becomes a target. Another mentions the palace gardener's son, and now a scandal is born. By morning, alliances shift, someone's been reassigned, and no one quite remembers what was actually said, only how it felt. Historians still argue whether the Empress herself ever orchestrated such bedtime coups, but the evidence is slippery. Like a lover's promise, or a blush that hides a threat. See, in Tang court life, the most powerful women weren't just beautiful, they were interpreters. Of mood, of tone, of political weather. And they trained each other. You're picturing high-class catfights, but that's a modern lie. These were seminars. Quiet instruction passed from older women to younger ones. How to sit just slightly higher on the bed. How to cry without ruining your eye makeup. How to pivot from a compliment to a confession in under 10 syllables. They knew the art of seductive misdirection. You ask about the emperor's dreams not because you care, but because dreams reveal fears. And fears are leverage. One of the best documented cases of this quiet manipulation involves Consort Wei, a lesser-known figure who managed to survive 4 palace purges simply by being forgettable in public, but unforgettable in private. Her strategy? Intimate ambiguity. She rarely spoke first, but once the emperor opened up, vented, sighed, even chuckled, she made mental notes. Then she fed those feelings back to him, wrapped in poetic metaphors. She didn't criticize rivals. She compared them to wilting orchids. She didn't suggest policy. She told stories of villages she dreamed of, where taxes were cruel and governors were unfair. Over time, these stories became real reforms, but no one could trace them back to her. That was the genius of it. She left no fingerprints. Only perfume. And don't think the men were immune. In fact, one of the most embarrassing royal anecdotes gleaned from Pillow Book fragments is about a high-ranking official who tried to impress a courtesan by revealing sensitive military logistics during post-coital bragging. She laughed at him, then repeated the information with perfect accuracy to a rival court faction. By dawn, he was demoted. She was promoted. This was pillow talk as espionage. Sexy, maybe, dangerous. Always, which brings us to something weirdly human, jealousy. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was currency. If you could provoke jealousy without triggering wrath, you became unforgettable. So some courtesans would stage it. They'd leave behind earrings in rival chambers, perfume handkerchiefs where eunuchs could find them, a smear of lipstick on the wrong wine cup. Then they'd deny everything with just enough hesitation to seem guilty. It was performance, one that fed into a larger strategy. Keep the emperor emotionally off balance. Make yourself the only reliable constant. In bed, this meant being part therapist, part seductress, part damage control specialist. If he mentioned another woman's name, you didn't get angry. You sighed, then told a sad story about someone who once betrayed you. Now you're the victim, and he's apologizing. And you're still naked, but suddenly you're winning. Quirky fact time, because yes, we promised you one per night. During the height of Tang luxury culture, some elite women dyed their teeth black as a fashion statement meant to signal mystery and detachment. The trend, imported from southern regions, was considered exotic, erotic, and slightly unnerving. The point wasn't to be traditionally beautiful. The point was to be unforgettable, to be a story, not just a face. Something men would whisper about later, uncertain whether they'd been kissed or cursed. So now, as you lie there, head swimming with plum wine and tangled loyalties, you start to get it. Tang women weren't just playing the game, they were the game. And they didn't always play to win. Sometimes they played to survive, or to stay remembered, or just to keep someone listening a little longer before dawn broke and the truth turned back into protocol. The next time someone says, she only got ahead because she slept with him, remember the Tang Dynasty, and ask, what did she say after? You wake, metaphorically, to the rustle of parchment and the faint scratch of a brush pen dipped in ink, not on a desk, but on a lover's bare back. That's your hook tonight. Imagine it. Someone is writing on your skin under the dim amber. Flicker of a lantern, whispering lines of instruction that sound like poetry, but are actually a sex education manual. Welcome to Elite Sex Ed, Tang Dynasty Edition, where knowledge isn't downloaded from awkward PowerPoint slides. It's transmitted body to body, metaphor by metaphor, often while lying sideways on a lacquered bed, both of you half-clothed. And wholly attentive. You're not handed a book, you become the book. The educated elite of this era didn't treat intimacy as something shameful to avoid or mysterious to fumble through. They studied it, they trained for it, and they passed it down like family heirlooms, not just the acts, but the dialogue that surrounded them. The pillow talk, the subtle art of knowing when to speak, how to speak, and when to shut up and listen with your fingertips. Most noble households kept instructional texts for this purpose, not scandalous porn, but highly literary guides filled with medical theory, Taoist philosophy, and yes, detailed strategies for emotional and physical intimacy. Fathers handed these to sons with a mixture of gravity and embarrassment. Mothers slipped them to daughters with whispered warnings. One preserved text included a section on bedroom breath, which wasn't about hygiene. It referred to the way you breathed while speaking during intimate moments. Slow, open-throated, emotional. Breathing too fast made you sound nervous. Breathing too slow made you seem manipulative. The ideal? Somewhere between a sigh and a secret. Historians still argue whether these manuals were widely followed or just idealized. Fantasies for the elite. But the fact remains, they existed. One particularly fascinating fragment from an aristocratic family collection advised women to never reveal jealousy unless it has been pre-seasoned with sweetness. That's a direct quote. It means, yes, you can be mad, but do it like you're offering him candied almonds, and then take his pillow. That's strategy. That's training. That's emotional jujitsu wrapped in a bedsheet. Let's look closer at this intersection between learning and loving. In Tang, China, a successful night wasn't judged by what happened under the covers, but by what was said afterward. Did your partner feel seen? Did they say something vulnerable? Did they fall asleep thinking you understood something about them that no one else had noticed? That was the win condition. The erotic part wasn't the climax, it was the crescendo of shared emotion. Words, perfectly timed, became tools of seduction. You could say, "You make me feel safe," or you could say, "When I breathe beside you, the room forgets winter exists." One of those gets you a thank you. The other gets you remembered for life. And this wasn't gender exclusive. Men had to learn this too. Poets like Bai Juyi and Yuan Zun weren't famous just for rhyming about flowers. They were idolized because their poems felt like pillow talk. One legendary story tells of a scholar who seduced the governor's daughter with nothing but a single poem written on a steamed bun. That's right. He wrote a verse on edible rice paper, steamed it into a bun, delivered it by eunuch, and waited. 3 days later, she invited him to read more verses at her family estate. She eventually disappeared from records. He published 3 collections. Coincidence? Doubtful. And then there's the physical component, because these conversations didn't happen in sterile silence. No, there were sensory environments. You lit specific incense to encourage openness. You chose certain textiles depending on whether you wanted conversation to drift or intensify. Silk sheets weren't just luxurious, they were sound modifiers. They softened movement, made whispers carry differently. The pillow itself mattered. The hardness of the ceramic variety kept your head upright, your airway open, your partner's voice crystal clear. Imagine someone leaning close and murmuring, I dreamed we were storks on opposite shores, and hearing every syllable like a bell struck just for you. That's the goal. Tang intimacy wasn't quiet because people were shy. It was quiet because every word was meant to land like a pedal soft, deliberate, unforgettable. Time for our nightly weird but true tidbit. Some manuals recommended practicing facial expressions in a mirror before bed, not to manipulate, but to become more emotionally transparent. They believed pillow talk required honesty, but not raw honesty, curated honesty. You were supposed to know how you looked when vulnerable, know how to express sadness without spiraling, know how to receive joy without seeming smug. Basically, pillow talk was performance art with a soul. So you're lying there now, slightly overwhelmed by the idea that somewhere around 800 CE, people were better at emotional intelligence than your last 3 situationships combined. And it's not wrong to feel a little envious. These people didn't always live long. Their politics were brutal. Their hygiene was questionable. But damn, they knew how to talk after sex. They knew how to take a vulnerable moment and stretch it into something meaningful, binding, strategic, maybe even divine. No one ghosted after Tang Dynasty pillow talk. You wrote a poem. You carved a comb. You sent incense across provinces just to say, I haven't forgotten how you sounded when you told me about your childhood. So here's your takeaway tonight. If a Tang nobleman or courtesan walked into your room now, they wouldn't judge your clothes or your mattress. They'd ask what you say in bed. Do you ask questions? Do you listen? Do you ever murmur something that makes another person feel like they matter in a way they hadn't even dared to believe? Because that, my sleepless friend, is the ancient art, not the act. The aftermath, you don't need to be fully awake to sense it. Something's tucked beneath the bed. No, not metaphorically. Literally. It's a book, soft bound in silk, edges smudged with fingerprints and time. You pull it out slowly, careful not to tear the threadbare corners, and there it is. A Tang Dynasty pillow book. Not the kind you buy in a museum gift shop, but the kind that passed from lover to lover, like contraband scripture. Smuggled under. Sleeves, read by candlelight, annotated in margins with ink drops that still smell faintly of camellia and inkstone. These weren't manuals in the traditional sense. They were part erotica, part therapy, part diary. You feel the weight of it emotionally, not just physically. Some pages contain detailed scenes of affection so poetic they feel like music. Others read like letters from people too afraid to say things out loud. Most were never meant to survive this long, but they did. Because someone couldn't bear to burn them. Someone believed that whispered memories, once written, deserved to linger. The content varies wildly. One page contains a list of flowers and their emotional temperatures, used to describe moods during pillow talk. Plum blossom, melancholy. With sweetness, chrysanthemum, restrained joy. Peony, veiled lust. You realize this isn't just metaphor, it's code. A love language laced with horticulture. Another page, more worn, reveals a dialogue between 2 unnamed lovers. The man begins with praise standard, flattering. But then she cuts through it with a single line. Your tongue is clever, but your silence is honest. Chills. This wasn't just about pleasure. It was about being witnessed. And the book doesn't shy away from pain, either. Some sections read like post-breakup letters never sent. A woman writes, he left without finishing the poem he promised me. Now every silence rhymes. You blink, you felt that. Maybe. Not in silk robes, but in blue texts marked read. You feel the echo across centuries. Historians still argue whether these pillow books were used more by women or men, but most agree they became emotional training tools. Imagine lying in bed next to someone and reading together, not aloud, necessarily, but in sync. Flipping pages between touches, pausing at lines that sting or thrill. Then responding, not with commentary, but with a glance, or a kiss, or a question. The Tang weren't obsessed with answers. They loved ambiguity, the space between certainty and suggestion. They believed mystery was erotic. You didn't have to explain everything. You had to feel everything and invite the other person to do the same. Pillow books weren't meant to be finished. They were meant to be continued by each new couple, each night, each whisper. They became relationship palimpsests, overwritten with emotion, but never truly erased. Let's pause for a second. You're thinking, okay, but isn't this all just romance? Not quite. These books were also deeply political. Some included scripts for redirecting imperial attention, how to subtly introduce concerns about a regional governor, or praise a rival without sounding disloyal. A page might say, tell him of the jasmine fields in Shu, how they bloomed late this year. Then ask if his tax envoy noticed. That's espionage disguised as reminiscing. No wonder certain copies were banned, burned, or sealed in palace archives. You weren't supposed to know how much power could be wrapped in a whispered memory. There's even a curious case of a forbidden sedition, unearthed in a noble tomb, that includes entire dialogues about reincarnation. The premise, lovers, reunited over lifetimes, always finding each other through specific phrases. Think of it as the Tang Dynasty version of a safe word, except spiritual. A line like, "Did the crane return this spring?" might mean, "I'm still yours, even in this body." It's heartbreakingly earnest and deeply weird. But you can't stop reading. Let's drop in tonight's fringe fact, because yes, this is the one you'll tell your friends tomorrow. Some couples had pillow book duels. Yes, actual back and forths written over days, each person responding in the margins like literary ping pong. One example features a woman challenging her lover's metaphors, line by line, with sharper, funnier verses. He tries to call her his gentle river. She replies, "Then stop trying to damn me." Savage, erotic, intellectually devastating. It wasn't just for play, it was battle. And sometimes it ended in laughter, sometimes in tears. Often, both. What makes these books unforgettable isn't just their sensuality. It's their honesty. You realize that behind the florid language and incensed metaphors, these people were just people. Anxious, hopeful, insecure. They used words to touch places they couldn't reach physically. They edited themselves less on paper than in conversation. Here, within ink and fiber, they let it all out: the joy, the jealousy, the things they weren't brave enough to say aloud. And now, centuries later, you're holding it, metaphorically thumbing their secrets, wondering what you'd write in the margin if you had the chance. So tonight, think about that. If someone were to read your pillow talk as literature, would they feel something? Would they see you? Or would it vanish, another unremarkable hush in the dark? Because the Tang left proof that whispers can outlive empires. All you have to do is write it down. You slip quietly through the midnight backstreets of Chang'an now, guided only by the dull flicker of oil lamps and the distant echo of a zither behind closed shutters. The city is asleep mostly, but the words are still moving. Notes tucked into sleeve cuffs, scrolls slid under doorways, verses etched onto steamed rice paper that dissolves after reading. This isn't just romantic drama. This is pillow talk weaponized into infrastructure. Chang'an was more than the imperial capital. It was a humming, breathing, gossiping organism where love letters moved faster than imperial decrees, and one wrong whisper could detonate a career. Everyone's watching their tongue, but they're also using it. Even now, someone in the merchant quarters is murmuring a confession to a courtesan who'll have it memorized by dawn and ready to weaponize it by lunch. Welcome to the undercurrent of the empire, where talk is currency and the pillow is both confessional and trap. By day, you'd never suspect it. The bureaucrats walk stiff-backed through court, reciting memorized protocol and keeping their gazes downward. But by night, some of those same men lie on lacquered beds murmuring secrets into the hair of entertainers, trained not only in music and dance, but in the art of retaining exactly the right memory. I told her something I've never said before, one official might whisper in the dark, not knowing she'll sell that story to a eunuch by morning, who, in turn, will leak it to a rival minister looking for leverage. Historians still argue whether the pillow talk economy of Chang'an was an open conspiracy or just a cultural side effect. But either way, the results are undeniable. Reassignments, arrests, rapid promotions, none of it clean, none of it random. Somewhere someone said too much in bed, and someone else took notes. One of the most compelling examples comes from a preserved court document detailing a dispute over provincial tax grain. The argument had gone on for months in court deadlocked. Then suddenly, the emperor reversed course, no explanation. Just a new edict, favoring a previously losing faction. Weeks later, a poem surfaced in a personal collection, written by a courtesan rumored to have shared company with the emperor's cousin. The last line? Grain from the West does not rot when touched by soft fingers. Cryptic, yes, but unmistakably pointed. You start to understand why poetry wasn't just art, it was subtext. It was plausible deniability. It was the weapon of the soft-spoken. Even more fascinating is how intimacy itself became part of state surveillance. Enter the listening screens thin. Partitions placed near elite beds, supposedly for modesty. But everyone knew they were for eunuchs, trained listeners. Imagine that. You're curled up beside someone, whispering your fears about a military governor, and on the other side of the screen, someone is jotting that down on parchment. For your own safety, of course, to maintain harmony. That was the official reason. The unofficial one, leverage. If things went south, the empire had receipts. In that world, a soft voice was more dangerous than a sword. Let's break the tension with tonight's weird fact. Some elite families hired private whisper tutors for their sons and daughters, individuals specifically trained in vocal modulation, tone control, and breath management. The goal? To teach you how to speak intimately in a way that evoked trust. One guidebook even suggested using a slightly hoarse tone when expressing grief, but a clear bell tone when speaking admiration. Why? Because sadness sounded more authentic when raw, but praise had to sound rehearsed, almost ceremonial. You're not flirting here, you're composing. You're a maestro of mood. And sometimes it all backfired. Like the case of Liang Xian, a minor bureaucrat whose love affair with a high-ranking consort was exposed not through letters, but through pillow echoes. A servant claimed she overheard a repeated phrase through the walls. Say it again, about the map. The map in question turned out to be a strategic border plan. The consort was executed. Liang was exiled. The servant got a promotion. It's a story told with hushed awe in surviving city ballads. And whether it happened exactly that way or not doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it could. That's the fear pillow talk carried here. Every murmur might be recorded, every confession a risk. But still, people talked. They had to. Because silence was its own kind of confession. What's even more compelling? The lovers didn't stop trusting each other. They just got better at disguising trust. Coded speech became common. One phrase might mean 5 things. The crane has flown early this year could reference travel, discontent, betrayal, or longing. It depended on context, on timing, on whether the incense was jasmine or not. Love became a linguistic puzzle box. You had to know someone deeply to understand what they really meant. And when you cracked it, when their eyes met yours, and you both understood the unsaid thing hiding behind the metaphor, that was the real intimacy. That was when you felt seen. Maybe even safe. So now, lying there in your imaginary Chang'an bed, warmed by poetry and threatened by context, ask yourself, who do you talk to like that? Who knows your second meanings? Who hears the thing behind the thing when you say, I'm fine? Maybe no one. Maybe that's what modern life has stolen, the risk of real emotional espionage. But the Tang, they leaned into it. They made vulnerability an art, not public, not performative. Just whispered. You're not ready for him, but he's here anyway, the eunuch. Not the pale background figure the movies give you. No, he enters like a shadow made of silk and secrets, moving between walls with a presence that feels both ghostly and godlike. His hands are soft, but his eyes have seen everything. He's the one who steps between the emperor and the women who crave his favor. He opens the door, fetches the tea, nods at the right time, and then carries the gossip to whoever pays best. You lie back against the memory of your imagined pillow, and you understand suddenly, in the world of Tang Dynasty pillow talk, no one has more power than the man who's supposed to have none. And that's the twist, isn't it? The eunuchs of the imperial court, castrated to keep them safe around the concubines, ended up knowing more about imperial intimacy than the ministers, generals, or even the empress herself. They were in the rooms before and after everything happened. They lit the lamps, changed the sheets, and sometimes stood behind the curtain listening while history turned in whispers. Not all eunuchs were equal, of course. Some were glorified servants, others like Gao Lishi, Xuanzang's personal attendant, held influence that made warlords nervous. Gao didn't just deliver messages, he edited them. Imagine that. You whisper a line to the emperor after sex, hoping he'll remember it in the morning. But before he can act on it, Gao rephrases it, twists the tone, makes it sound like a compliment or a threat, depending on what he wants. And that's the part the Tang knew but rarely said aloud. Pillow talk wasn't always a conversation between two lovers. It was a three-person performance. You, them, and the eunuch standing just outside the canopy. Or maybe inside, pretending to adjust the incense burner. Or silently serving tea while you think no one's listening. But someone always is. Historians still argue whether eunuchs manipulated emperors or merely amplified their desires. But the results are undeniable. Emperors changed their minds after whispered consultations. Edicts were softened or clarified based on what a eunuch remembered hearing in a sultry moment. And sometimes, entire relationships were broken by a single well-placed anecdote. One infamous record details how a top-ranked consort fell from grace after a eunuch accidentally repeated her post-coital comment about the emperor's thinning hair. It was meant as a joke, maybe even flirtation, but the way it was repeated? Dry, dispassionate, fatal. She was dismissed within the week. Her quarters reassigned. Her name removed from court poetry. That's power, not brute, not loud. Just surgical. And don't think they didn't enjoy it. Some eunuchs lived vicariously through the passions they managed. They collected verses, remembered the best lines, judged lovers by how creatively they flattered each other in bed. In fact, our weird tidbit tonight, there's a recorded instance of a eunuch compiling his own best of pillow talk moments, poetic lines overheard across different chambers, all anonymized, of course. He ranked them, not by beauty, but by effectiveness. The top line, "I forget my father's face when I look into your eyes." Intense, disturbing, apparently unforgettable. That's the kind of thing that echoed, not just in the emperor's head, but in the halls of power. But don't pity them. Eunuchs weren't just neutral tools. Many were former scholars, musicians, even minor nobility who entered palace service after some family misfortune or political accident. They brought with them ambition, taste, and education. So when they listened in on pillow talk, they understood. They didn't just hear words, they analyzed them, considered their tone, assessed emotional stakes, compared delivery styles. They were curators of intimacy. And they played favorites. If a particular consort was clever, kind, or consistently generous, her secrets might stay secret. But cross one of them, your metaphors became memoranda. And here's where it gets beautifully perverse. Some eunuchs were better lovers than the men they served, not sexually, obviously, but emotionally. Courtesans and consorts sometimes confided more in their eunuch attendants than in their official partners. Because with the eunuch, there was no seduction game. No ranking, no performance, just talk. Imagine a woman dressed in gold-threaded robes, crying into the lap of a eunuch while a wind chime tinkles in the background. She's not trying to manipulate. She's just tired, and he listens, offers a hand, maybe a line of verse. She remembers that kindness. Next time her lover asks for advice, she steers him gently toward the eunuch's political ally. That's how the system worked. Not with decrees, with favors, with feelings. So tonight, as you drift in and out of these imagined chamber scenes, think about the people just out of frame. The ones who see everything but are rarely seen. The ones who don't participate in the act, but shape everything around it. The eunuch isn't your enemy or your friend. He's your witness. And sometimes your fate. You might believe that. What you say in bed stays there. In the Tang Dynasty, it's precisely the opposite. The bed is a microphone. And the man folding your robe in the corner, he's your audience. You tilt your head upward, and there it is gazing down at you from the canopy above the bed, a painting. Not just any painting. This one watches you back. Its eyes are too knowing, its lines too fluid. The courtesan lying beside you says nothing. She doesn't have to. You've both seen it. Lovers locked in an embrace, rendered in a style too graceful to be obscene, too detailed to be innocent. Welcome to the erotic art of the Tang Dynasty, where brushstrokes weren't just decoration, they were conversation starters. And not the shy, blushing kind. These scrolls and murals, tucked behind lattice screens or folded into private albums, were meant to stir the blood and the mind. You're not looking at porn, you're looking at philosophy, politics, longing, aesthetics. This is where visual, art and pillow talk collide. Because in Tang China, paintings weren't mute. They flirted, provoked, comforted. Sometimes they even testified. When words were too risky, too clumsy, too loud, someone just pointed to the wall and said, "That's how I feel. Let's set the scene." You're in a scholar's study, which also happens to be a bedroom, because of course it is. And there's a scroll unfurled across the far wall. Two women seated beneath a plum tree, one leaning in, the other blushing. It's subtle, delicate, but unmistakably charged. Maybe the scholar put it there to impress his guests. Maybe it's a private indulgence. Or maybe it's a tool. Because here's the twist. Erotic paintings were often used as conversation starters for intimate discussions. You didn't just watch them, you discussed them. The way the wrist curves here, the way the fabric almost reveals but doesn't, these became metaphors for desire, frustration, memory. You're not talking about the painting. You're talking about yourself, but safely, indirectly, with a cushion of plausible deniability. Historians still argue whether these images were common in average households or confined to elite spaces. But what's certain is that in Shenzhen, artist quarters, commissions for intimate scrolls were booming. Some even included instructions. Unroll only after midnight. View in silence. Do not share without consent. That's right, Tang artists pioneered the original content warning, because the image wasn't meant to shock. It was meant to open something. A memory. A conversation. A confession. Maybe you're lying beside someone new, unsure what to say. So instead of fumbling for compliments, you gesture toward the hanging silk and ask, "What do you think she feels?" And just like that, you're not strangers anymore. You're decoding beauty together. Take, for instance, a surviving piece attributed, though debated, to Zhou Fang, the master of feminine portraiture. The scroll depicts a woman combing her hair while looking into a mirror held by another woman. Innocent? Hardly. The act of grooming was layered with intimacy in Tang culture. Sharing a mirror meant sharing trust. The mirror bearer sees what the other cannot, her vulnerability, her unguarded expression. This image wasn't just erotic because of the implied nudity. It was erotic because of the attention. The mirror holder isn't passive. She's complicit, observant. You look at that painting too long, and you forget which one you are. Tonight's fringe fact: some erotic paintings came with embedded poetry, tiny verses written in micro calligraphy between the folds of a sleeve or in the curve of a shoulder. You'd only see them up close, maybe even need a lens. The point wasn't just a surprise, it was to reward attention. Lovers would sometimes copy those secret verses and use them in their own pillow talk. One such line, hidden in the hem of a red robe, reads, "The ink has not dried, and already your scent has faded." It hits you. Not just for its sadness, but for its precision. That's what these paintings did. They made the invisible visible, the fleeting permanent. At least for a while. And let's be honest, some of it was funny. Not everything was tragic elegance. There are scrolls, still preserved in private collections, that depict lovers caught in awkward positions, or with exaggerated expressions of surprise, or hiding under tables to avoid discovery. Tang humor was bawdy, and sometimes artists played with the absurdity of desire. A man tangled in a woman's robes, accidentally tying himself up. A noble woman pulling a curtain aside with one eye arched like, "Are you done yet?" These images were risk, yes, but also honest. They reminded viewers, passion is messy. People are ridiculous. And that, too, is beautiful. Now consider this. Some couples commissioned erotic portraits of themselves, not for vanity, for memory, for legacy. These weren't public. They were hidden, shown only during special moments, anniversaries, reconciliations, emotional relapses. One surviving scroll shows a real-life couple seated beneath a wadong tree, their hands intertwined, but not quite touching. You can feel the tension between them, soft sadness, maybe the ache of something they lost or feared to lose. The fact that they painted that, not just their ecstasy, but their fragility, tells you everything about the emotional intelligence of this culture. They weren't performing for anyone. They were preserving a moment. So tonight, think about what you hang on your own walls, what you scroll through before bed. Is it distraction or reflection? Does it challenge you or numb you? Because the Tang believed your visual world shaped your emotional one. What you looked at became how you spoke. And how you spoke became how you loved. You hear it before you see it. The clatter of lacquered shoes, laughter draped in silk, and the thrum of drums low and slow like a heartbeat. You round a corner in the early morning haze of Chang'an, and there it is. A matchmaking market. No, not the app kind. Not the kind where you swipe and ghost. This is analog chemistry with 1,000 spectators, a sensory overload of perfume, scrolls, face reading, astrological charts, and whispered negotiations. You're not here to buy dumplings. You're here to find a partner. Or rather, to become one. This isn't a flirtation pit, it's a strategic arena. And every fan flutter, every sideways glance, every too loud laugh is part of a careful dance older than the dynasty itself. You've just entered the Tang Dynasty's version of Tinder, and unlike your phone, this place won't let you hide behind filters or witty bios. Here, your horoscope's compatibility matters more than your hair. Your scent matters more than your shoes. And if you can't improvise a couplet on the spot, you're already losing. Matchmaking fairs were seasonal, social, and semi-chaotic. Entire families would show up in disguise, not for modesty, but to eavesdrop without being judged. Mothers posed as merchants. Uncles watched from the tea stalls. And the youth, they performed. You'd think romance would blossom in quiet. But no, the Tang loved spectacle. One illegible scholar might recite a spontaneous poem about plum blossoms wilting on a rainy rooftop. A noble woman, standing nearby, would toss a silk ribbon toward the poem if it stirred her, or pretend to. She might be testing him, seeing how he reacts, confidence but not arrogance, vulnerability but not weakness. This wasn't love at first sight, it was compatibility theater. And the script? Improvise. Now, if you're imagining a formal lineup of nervous singles bowing stiffly, think again. These fairs were sensual, not explicit, but loaded. A woman's sleeve brushing yours might signal interest or challenge. The incense in her hair might be dragon's blood, rare and suggestive. The fan she carries might be painted with phrases like timely wind or fated crossing, subtle cues only the well-read would recognize. You couldn't fake this stuff. Pillow talk started here, in daylight, among crowds, before anyone got anywhere near a bed. It was soft power before the sheets. Historians still argue whether these matchmaking events were genuinely about romance or mostly arranged by families in disguise. But many surviving diaries suggest that love or at least desire found its way in. One notorious nobleman kept a record of the ribbons he received, 12 in one day, each a different color, each with a hidden message stitched into the edge. One read, "I've dreamt of your voice, though I haven't heard it." Another said simply, "Too late." She'd seen him, hesitated, and by the time she'd made her move, he was gone. The ribbons became their own language, and he kept them bundled in his pillow for years. Intimacy began before the first touch, and this wasn't limited to the elites. Even artisans and musicians held their own matching markets in smaller quarters. The rules were the same, if not stricter. Reputation was everything. A bad rumor could follow you for life. A well-placed compliment, though, that could win you protection, patronage, even promotion. One musician reportedly seduced a city clerk simply by composing a tune that echoed his family's ancestral melody. He heard it, wept, and found her the next day. She denied knowing the song. He knew she lied. They were married within a week. Tonight's offbeat fact: some matchmaking fairs included smell contests. Yes, literal scent evaluations. Participants wore handkerchiefs scented with their personal blend: jasmine for warmth, sandalwood for melancholy, mugwort for curiosity. Partners would exchange these scarves discreetly. If the scent lingered with you by nightfall, it was considered a sign. One popular belief was that certain yin-flavored body chemistries harmonized with yang-fragrant ones, creating an invisible balance that foretold long-term compatibility. Science? Maybe not. But emotionally? Spot on. But of course, beneath all the beauty and ritual, there was calculation. Astrologers stood by with star charts, ready to veto a match that looked good on paper, but terrible in the stars. A perfect poem could be undone by a mismatched fire-water alignment. Families might pressure a daughter to accept a suitor who looked good in public, but reeked of arrogance in private. That's why these fairs were double-layered. The performance up front, the whispers behind. The real matchmaking happened in corners, and glances held just a second too long. In a fan that fluttered twice, then stopped. These were coded conversations. The beginning of pillow talk, even if no one touched yet. The questions were there. Do you understand me? Do you see me? Would you protect me when no one else does? And sometimes, people found the answer. One of the most beloved poems of the Tang era begins with, "She stepped on my shadow at the spring fair. I turned and never turned back." It's romantic, sure, but it's also precise. That physical, unintentional connection feed on shadow became a metaphor for intertwined fates. Think about that next time you pass someone too closely in a crowd. The Tang would have considered it destiny. So now imagine you're there, fan in hand, eyes scanning the crowd. You're not looking for perfection. You're looking for rhythm. The subtle pulse of someone who moves like your sentences, thinks in metaphors you already understand, laughs in the same key. Because here, that's the spark. Not lust, not wealth, but cadence. a shared frequency, a matching melody. And once you find it, everything else is just prelude. You hear it before you see him: soft laughter, a swish of silk, the rhythmic jingle of an ornamental belt not designed for stealth. He enters the room like a ripple in still water, calm but impossible to ignore. This isn't a woman. This is a man. And he's here to seduce you. Not with brawn or bluster, but with calligraphy ink under his fingernails and a poem tucked behind his ear. Meet the male courtesan, the Tang Dynasty's most unsettling threat to fragile masculinity and unprepared hearts alike. You thought pillow talk was the province of palace concubines and poetesses? Think again. These men were every bit as refined, every bit as manipulative, every bit as devastating. They knew when to pause between words, when to sigh, when to lean close and say something so layered in meaning that you'd spend the entire next week reinterpreting it. And yes, they wore eyeliner. Because why not make eye contact a weapon? You're sitting there now, suddenly unsure who's seducing whom. He offers you wine, not because you need it, but because he wants to watch how you drink it. He compliments your posture, your voice, your restraint. And then he recites something, not too showy, not too crude, just perfectly calibrated. It's not about love, not directly. It's about longing, about a missed meeting, about someone who waited too long to speak. And in that moment, you realize you're in danger not of losing your virtue, but of losing control. The Tang were unapologetic about beauty, and they didn't limit it by gender. A well-groomed man was a currency unto himself. Soft skin, soft voice, sharp wit. If he made you feel seen, even briefly, it didn't matter who you were or who you thought you preferred. He had you. Historians still argue whether male courtesans held real sway or were just entertaining curiosities. But if you look close enough at the poems, the diaries, the scandals, the gifts exchanged in secret, it's clear. These men weren't accessories. They were arsenals. One court record tells of a noble woman who refused 3 powerful marriage proposals because she was entangled with a male singer whose voice moved her liver, which, in Tang metaphor, means soul-level devastation. He couldn't offer land, title, or offspring, just company, just words, just pillow talk so good it rewired her priorities. These men weren't just romantic distractions, they were dangerous confidants. Because people talked to them, really talked. Emperors, officials, daughters of generals. After the music stopped and the wine cooled, they stayed, listened, responded, with the perfect anecdote, the perfect line, and sometimes recorded what they heard. Not out of malice necessarily, but because stories were power, and they were masters of story. One particularly clever example: a male courtesan named Lin Yu, known for his ability to mimic voices. He'd entertain clients by reenacting famous court debates in perfect pitch, including imagined bedroom conversations between lovers who weren't supposed to be together. It was satire, it was hilarious, until one of those performances mirrored real events a little too closely, and a scandal unraveled. How did he know? Who told him? No one ever proved anything, but Lin Yu suddenly had new robes, and his old rivals suddenly had new exiles. Let's pause for our nightly oddity. Male courtesans, unlike their female counterparts, often wore scent on their tongues. That's right, little beads of flavored resin, cinnamon, cardamom, mint pressed beneath the tongue before a meeting. The goal wasn't to freshen breath. It was to create a sensory signature. A kiss or even a whispered phrase would leave behind a memory more potent than perfume. If you tasted cinnamon in your dream that night, you knew who to blame. The Tang were nothing if not immersive. And they dressed the part, not flamboyantly, but artfully. Robes tailored to suggest movement. Not too tight, just enough to reveal grace. Their hair was immaculate, often adorned with subtle silver pins shaped like plum blossoms or ink brushes. These weren't costumes, these were cues. Everything said, "I am both a mirror and a mask. Look closely." But only if you're ready. The real magic, though, wasn't in their appearance. It was in their emotional accuracy. They knew when to pivot a conversation from flirtation to philosophy. When to ask about your family, when not to. When to let a silence stretch, not awkwardly, but meaningfully. And that's the art modern lovers often forget. Silence doesn't have to be empty. In the Tang world, silence was a test. Could you sit with someone and let the absence of words say more than their presence? Male courtesans mastered that. Made you feel like your pauses were profound. Your unfinished thoughts understood. So here you are, lying on your imaginary brocade pillow, trying to shake his voice from your head. He's long gone now, probably performing for someone more important. But he left you something. Not a gift, not a promise. Just that strange lingering feeling that someone once really listened to you. That someone said just enough. And nothing more. And now? You'll never forget him. You're not supposed to be here, but you are. Crouched in the corner of an opulent chamber that smells of rose oil and freshly sharpened ink brushes, watching two lovers lie together in that dangerous post-coital hush. This is the moment where history often exhales. But tonight, it holds its breath. Because this isn't just pillow talk. This is treason, dressed in a silk robe. This is a whisper that will travel farther than the loudest trumpet. The woman resting her head on the general's chest is not just a beauty, she's the emperor's niece. And the man gently stroking her hair has command over 20,000 troops stationed inconveniently close to the capital. She murmurs something about loyalty. He answers with something about freedom. No one raises their voice. No one needs to. It's already too late. You've stumbled into one of the Tang Dynasty's most whispered scandals, where the line between seduction and strategy becomes so blurred, it might as well be fog. We often imagine pillow talk as tender, romantic, emotionally charged. But here, it's something sharper. A dagger hidden beneath silk. A lover's sigh doubling as a war drum. Because in the Tang court, nothing was as dangerous as being alone with someone who wanted something. And who knew you well enough to get it without asking directly. The records of these events are, of course, fractured fragments in old biographies, suggestive lines in banished poems, redacted passages in official histories. Historians still argue whether the Yang affair was a genuine love story gone wrong or an elaborate political play masked by intimacy. But the result is undeniable. After 3 nights together, the general begins to shift his loyalties. After 5, he delays a key shipment of grain to the capital. After 7, he disappears entirely, taking his soldiers and part of the western border with him. By the time the emperor hears about the betrayal, it's not through a military report. It's through a eunuch's quiet message. He no longer sleeps alone. That's the thing about pillow talk. It's always more than it seems. A murmur becomes a motive. A soft question becomes a declaration. A kiss becomes a coup. The Tang knew this. They lived it. They feared it. And they exploited it. One haunting example involves a poet official named Shen Su, who fell in love with a palace seamstress. He thought it was innocent, a few lines of verse passed during mending, a few shared meals. But she was connected to a powerful consort faction, and she listened. Oh, did she listen? Especially after the wine. Shen, in his passion and foolishness, began to recite unfinished political critiques in bed. Not because he was disloyal, just because he was brilliant and wanted to impress her. Within weeks, those critiques were rewritten, anonymously published. And used to attack his own allies in court, he was confused. Then ashamed, then exiled. She stayed silent. Her sewing needles sharp as ever. Now, here's your delightfully strange fact of the night. Certain Tang elite kept listening pillows, hollow ceramic headrests designed to subtly amplify sound. On one side, this was practical easier. To hear a lover's voice without them needing to raise it. But some scholars believe they served another function: surveillance. Whispered conversations could be picked up more clearly by someone in the next room. Think about that. You're lying on a beautifully painted porcelain pillow, sharing your fears, your dreams, your criticisms of a recent imperial decision, and the sound is gently floating through a hole into another chamber where someone is sipping tea, nodding, and taking notes. But let's not reduce all pillow talk to espionage, because it's also what made the betrayals hurt. The general who defects doesn't just leave a battlefield. He leaves a body, a breath, a rhythm. The poet who's undone by a seamstress isn't just outmaneuvered, he's heartbroken. And the worst betrayals in Tang history weren't shouted. They were whispered, in the dark, followed by silence so loud it echoes for centuries. The real tension wasn't between lovers and empires. It was between vulnerability and ambition. You lie beside someone, feel them breathe, feel their words press into your skin, and you choose to believe it's real, even when you know it might not be. That's the tragedy. That's the risk. And that's what made pillow talk in the Tang Dynasty so perilous. It didn't ask for proof, just presence. So tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, remember this. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sighs. And the most world-shaking words in history? They weren't spoken in court. They were whispered in bed. You're standing at the edge of a moonlit veranda now, watching the faint silhouette of a man staring down at a folded silk fan in his hands. He's not weeping, but his shoulders tremble like he might be. Behind him, the candle still burns in the chamber where, hours ago, a woman recited his poem back to him, line for line, as if she'd plucked it from his ribs instead of a page. He thought it was foreplay. It was actually foreshadowing, because now she's gone, disappeared, into a procession of lanterns and eunuchs and diplomatic protocol, and all he has left is her voice, echoing his own words like a curse. That's what you're stepping into tonight. The story of how a single poem, murmured in the wrong bed, at the wrong hour, with the wrong metaphor, can unmake a man in the Tang Dynasty. Love is not just fragile here, it's weaponized, and every syllable carries the weight of reputation. Let's talk about the poets. The Tang era practically sweats lyricism. You couldn't spit plum wine in a tea house without hitting someone. Mid-haiku. And among these feverishly creative souls, pillow talk wasn't a side effect of passion, it was the engine of it. These weren't people who made love and then talked. They talked, and that was the making of love. A single verse could elevate a night from physical to metaphysical, and that was intoxicating. Also, deeply dangerous. Because once you entwine your emotions with language, those words don't stay put. They wander. They echo. They're misquoted, repurposed, turned into evidence. One such tale? The melancholy spiral of Lu Yan, a middling official with celestial-level verse. He meets her, Lady Jin, known for her wit, her restraint, her impossible cheekbones, and he falls fast. He sends her a poem. She corrects it. He writes another. She replies with a riddle. They meet, finally, under the guise of literary exchange. And that night, on the lacquered floor of her borrowed chamber, they lie together, whispering couplets like they're secrets. Except they are secrets, because Lady Jin is technically attached to someone with a title and a sword. Lu knows this. He thinks he's being clever. He references her situation with metaphors: trapped bird, caged moon, that sort of thing. She laughs, encourages him. He's intoxicated, emboldened. He writes a new piece that night. Doesn't publish it, just gives it to her. She disappears 3 days later. The poem resurfaces, rewritten with minor edits, in a public anthology that happens to land on the emperor's desk. In the revised version, the metaphors aren't subtle. They point fingers. Lady Jin's cage becomes a recognizable title. Lu's shackles of silk can only mean the military family she's connected to. He's not just heartbroken, he's implicated. The emperor frowns, The military family fumes. Lady Jin is sent away, likely to a temple. Lu is offered an exile. Post so remote even the tea tastes like disappointment. He accepts it with a bowed head and no defense. What would he say? That he didn't mean it? That it was just pillow talk? Historians still argue whether Lady Jin leaked the poem herself out of revenge, or if it was stolen, or if Lu, in some moment of arrogance, handed it to the wrong friend. The truth's buried somewhere under centuries of redacted archives and fading ink. But the moral lingers, in a culture that revered poetry above almost everything. To speak beautifully was to risk being misunderstood. And when love ends in exile, the only thing left is the echo of what you thought was safe. Tonight's quirky detour? Tang ink was occasionally infused with flower oil. Not for permanence, but for scent. Imagine this. You write a love letter with jasmine-infused ink. When your lover opens it, even if they don't recognize your brushwork, they smell you. Pillow talk by proxy. One recovered fragment from a noblewoman's collection read. The words have dried, but your fragrance remains. It's almost too perfect. Back to Lu. In exile, he continues to write. His later poems lose some of their lyrical flourish, but gain something rawer, less performative. One of his final works before death is a quiet meditation on breath. She stole mine, and I never quite recovered. It's not the kind of thing that wins festivals, but it guts you, doesn't it? So here's the real tragedy. The Tang didn't believe love was safe. They believed it was glorious because it was dangerous. Words, when whispered under moonlight, carried the same weight as promises or threats. You couldn't unsay them. And the risk was always that the one thing meant only for the dark would be heard in daylight. So as you lie back now, maybe with your own thoughts racing, think carefully. If someone turned your last late-night message into verse, would it damn you or deliver you? You hear it before you feel it fluttering silk, the delicate snap of a folding fan, and the barely there shift of breath against skin. Not touch, almost touch. And in that suspended moment, you realize something unnerving no one said. A word, and yet, somehow, the room is heavy with meaning. Welcome to the slow burn world of coded gestures, where pillow talk doesn't begin with a sentence but with the arc of a wrist, the pattern of a sigh, the angle at which a fan opens, and closes. In the Tang Dynasty, intimacy wasn't always verbal. It was choreographed. And when words could be misquoted, misheard, or misunderstood, lovers found other ways to speak quieter, cleverer, more dangerous. You're seated now on a low platform bed, opposite a woman who hasn't looked directly at you once. Her hair is pinned with white jade. Her robe spills like water across the cushions. She holds a fan in her hand, not to cool herself, but to speak. It flicks once. Closed. That means impatience. It opens slowly, curved slightly toward her face. Interest. She taps it against her left wrist. That's a question. She hasn't said anything. She doesn't need to. This is courtship through theater, a flirtation rendered in brushstrokes and shadows. And if you don't know the code, you're not invited to play. You begin to understand the genius of it. This is conversation with plausible deniability. If a eunuch walks in, you're just watching her adjust her fan. If someone's listening, they'll hear nothing but silence and breath. But if you're fluent in the dialect of longing, this is a monologue. Let's go deeper. Fan language wasn't random. Entire handbooks were written on it. Some even paired movements with types of incense or music to create layered emotional cues. A glance plus a specific fan flick might mean, I miss you, but I'm angry. A fan dropped intentionally could signal forgiveness or permission. Lovers practiced this. They rehearsed. It wasn't unlike fencing, but with more silk and more heartbreak. A courtesan might spend years perfecting her gestures to ensure one moment of complete emotional clarity with the right person. At the fundi, right hour, under the right phase of the moon. It sounds absurd until you see it work. Until you realize she's made. You feel more with a single flick of the wrist than any modern love song has in years. But it wasn't just women. Men used gesture too. Not the fan, perhaps, but the breath. Tang men, especially poets and scholars, trained themselves to breathe rhythmically during intimate moments. It was said that the most seductive partners could sync their breath to their lovers until it became indistinguishable, one slow inhale, one trembling exhale like tide in undertow. This wasn't tantric mysticism. This was emotional engineering. To breathe like someone was to become them. And that was intimacy beyond touch, beyond even speech. Tonight's strange but real historical aside. There are surviving records of entire breath duels, competitions among courtesans and favored officials where couples would lie beside each other, fully clothed, and attempt to maintain synchronized breathing while exchanging no words. Observers would judge based on facial tension, sweat, pupil dilation. The best duos were rewarded with rare wines, the losers with embarrassment. But even that became a kind of intimacy. Because to try syncing breath is to admit vulnerability. You're trying to find rhythm in someone else's chaos. And failing, together, quietly, is sometimes more revealing than succeeding. And let's not forget espionage. Oh yes, these nonverbal cues were often used to pass secret information. A fan with an extra tassel. A folded sleeve revealing a hidden thread pattern. Even the cadence of footsteps approaching the bedchamber could signal to an insider whether it was safe to speak freely. One recorded instance tells of a noble woman who saved her lover from assassination simply by dropping her fan twice, slowly, then once quickly. That was their code for someone is listening behind the wall. He changed the subject, laughed, survived. Historians still debate the extent to which this silent language permeated everyday court life, or whether it was a glamorous fiction, repeated by later dynasties yearning for Tang elegance. But here's what can't be denied. The Tang people believed that intimacy didn't require volume, or even vocabulary. What mattered was intent, and the willingness to be present in the space between words. So tonight, as you lie there in your imagined chamber, the shadows pulsing against the screen from a flickering lamp, consider this. How often have you missed the real message because you were waiting for the words? How many times did someone say something with their posture, their breath, their hesitation, and you didn't catch it? The Tang didn't wait for clarity. They leaned into ambiguity. And in doing so, they made space for a kind of honesty that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. Maybe it's time we tried listening like that again. You walk into the chamber and it hits you before anything else. The fabric. Not scent, not sound, not even the presence of another person. Just the overwhelming, calculated pressure of textile. Brocade drapes so thick they hush every footstep. Embroidered silk cushions that refuse to wrinkle. Sleeves too long, collars too stiff. Garments layered so meticulously that removing them becomes its own intimate ritual. You're not just undressing someone, you're disarming them. Welcome to the softest walls in the Tang Dynasty. Silk and etiquette. Because here, the boundary between you and another person isn't just emotional or social. It's woven. And pillow talk? It doesn't start with words. It starts with fabric. With how much of you is visible, and how much is deliberately hidden. She stands before you now, layered in meaning. Her outer robe is woven with cloud motifs, signifying ambiguity, fluid identity. Beneath, a sliver of blue gauze peeks out water. Vulnerability, suggestion. Her hairpin glints with mother of pearl, shaped like a phoenix with wings folded inward. That's not just jewelry, that's commentary. She's not inviting you in. She's asking whether you're even worthy of seeing what's beneath. Because in this world, intimacy isn't stripped, it's granted. Slowly, strategically, silk by silk. The Tang obsession with fabric wasn't just aesthetic, it was architectural. A person's clothing constructed their identity, room by room, boundary by boundary. And breaking those boundaries, that took time, permission, conversation, which is where pillow talk entered the frame not as casual postlude, but as the crowbar gently prying apart the palace doors of a well-armored soul. And yes, men wore armor too, not metal, but layers of linen dyed in imperial colors, sashes tied just so. Boots made for elegance, not warfare. To lie beside someone in this world wasn't just about exposure, it was about negotiation. Each loosened knot was a sentence. Each sleeve pushed down. A shoulder was a question. Do you see me now? Will you still speak gently when I'm bare? Historians still argue whether these layers served more ceremonial or practical purposes. But one thing is certain. Clothing dictated proximity. Literally. Certain robes extended so far that lovers had to sit a specific distance apart, even in private. But the truly intimate knew how to navigate it. A brush of fingers beneath a sleeve. A shared cup held between overlong cuffs. One poet wrote, "We spoke through our sleeves until silence became unnecessary." You can feel it, can't you? The heat of being almost understood. And it wasn't just class that dictated who wore what, it was intention. A concubine dressed for performance might choose a robe dyed with safflower, known to deepen the red of flushed skin under candlelight. A noblewoman anticipating a late-night conversation might wear undyed linen, signaling emotional openness. Even the stitching mattered. One recovered garment bears a hidden phrase stitched along the hem. "If I turn away, follow." Not meant to be read in daylight, only discovered when kneeling. That's how the Tang encoded their hearts into fibers, not phrases. Let's detour, as promised, to your strange fact of the night. Some Tang-era lovers sent pieces of their clothing to one another not as romantic keepsakes, but as conversation starters. A torn cuff, a sash that smelled faintly of lotus water. One man even mailed a single embroidered frog from his lover's slipper, along with the note, "I've lost the pair to time, but not to memory." He was married to someone else by then. But that slipper frog? He kept it beneath his pillow. And let's talk body language. Because in this heavily wrapped world, your posture was your punctuation. A slightly tilted neck implied openness. Knees aligned beneath the fabric said, "I'm listening." Feet pointing away, emotional closure. There's a famous court etiquette guide that reads more like a seduction manual. A woman who sits in stillness teaches her lover to reach with his breath, not his hands. If you wanted to be close to someone, you didn't crawl over to them. You adjusted your robe just enough for your wrist to brush theirs when you lifted your teacup. But class mattered, of course. The lower your rank, the fewer layers you wore not. Because you were less modest, but because fabric cost silver. So intimacy among the poor was more immediate, more physical, less encoded. A village girl might say what she feels. A palace concubine? She'd ask you about your dreams, then fold the corner of her robe to show her answer. And that gap, the one between directness and artifice, that's where the Tang found beauty, in subtlety, in restraint, in the slow peeling back of. Metaphor. So now, as you settle beneath your imaginary coverlet patterned in phoenixes you'll never own, ask yourself, how many layers do you wear when you speak to someone? Not your clothes, your sentences, your tone, your curated pauses, your artful dodges. Have you ever let someone loosen the knot just enough to see who you are beneath all that brocade? In the Tang Dynasty, the most scandalous thing you could do wasn't disrobe. It was disarm, with softness, with words, with silk so sheer it almost counted as trust. You step into a room dimly lit by amber lanterns, and the air is thick, not just with incense, but with intent. You're not in a lover's chamber tonight. You're somewhere stranger, deeper. Space filled with charms, talismans, polished bronze mirrors, and little red silk pouches tied shut with trembling fingers. These aren't just bedroom curios. These are tools, weapons, and sometimes prayers. Welcome to the realm of Tang love magic, where the pillow isn't just a stage for flirtation, it's a battlefield for invisible forces. Tonight, you'll learn how desire was channeled, intensified, sometimes bound with thread and blood and whispered spells. And you'll learn how one wrong charm could ruin more than a night. It could twist a heart in knots that no words could untie. The Tang believed love wasn't merely chemistry, it was cosmology. Attraction was influenced by birth stars, bodily humors, the hour of your first breath, and yes, the shape of your ears. Pillow talk in this world wasn't just emotional, it was energetic. That meant if words failed you, and they often did, you turned to talismans. You lit candles carved with dragon sigils. You slept with a stone warmed under the full moon. You wrote someone's name on yellow paper and burned it under your pillow, hoping the smoke would carry your longing to their dreams. It sounds superstitious, but it was deadly serious. Because magic in Tang China wasn't theatrical. It was domestic, intimate, woven into bedding, tucked inside robes, whispered when breath was shallow. Let's start with aphrodisiacs. Some couples brewed teas laced with powdered pearl, believing it softened the heart. Others burned resins like argo wood to open emotional meridians in the body. A particularly daring recipe involved crushed fireflies, yes, fireflies mixed, into a love potion meant to make the drinker glow with affection. And then there were the curses. Jealous lovers might hide red thread dolls beneath a rival's pillow, bound at the ankles and blindfolded, symbolizing emotional paralysis. If your relationship suddenly turned cold overnight, well, it might not be your fault. Someone might have sewn your fate closed behind your back. Historians still argue whether the more extreme rituals were widely practiced or reserved for the fringes of society. But even in the imperial palace, evidence of love charms has been recovered. One empress reportedly commissioned a mirror etched with the characters for "Return to Me," placed beneath her husband's bed when he began visiting another's chamber too often. It didn't bring him back, but the woman he favored was mysteriously reassigned to a distant province weeks later. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world where symbols mattered, so did the belief behind them. Let's talk about dream visitations. One of the most haunting forms of pillow magic involved slipping into a lover's sleep. The Tang believed dreams were liminal spaces, half-worlds where thoughts became real. If you couldn't reach someone by letter or gesture, you could try to appear in their dreams. There were rituals for this. Fast for a day, bathe in lotus-infused water, then write a verse of longing and place it under your tongue as you fell. Asleep, if the bond was strong, they would see you, feel you, maybe even wake weeping. And if they didn't, well, that told you something too. Time for tonight's strange but true tidbit. One noble woman kept a silk pillow stuffed not with down or cotton, but with tiny paper fragments, each inscribed with a sentence she wished she'd said to her lost lover. Hundreds of them. Her chambermaid found it years later. Most were faded. One still legible read: "If you had turned once more before leaving, I would have stayed." That's not magic. That's heartbreak. But in the Tang world, the two were often the same thing. Love talismans weren't all dark, of course. Some were celebratory. Couples would create twin charms, often rings or embroidered knots, and keep them hidden until a full moon, when they'd exchange them without speaking. The idea was that the object absorbed your silence, your longing, your presence. That's what made it sacred, not the material. The memory. You weren't just giving a token. You were handing over a distilled version of yourself. And sometimes, lovers crossed lines. There are court records of one official who bribed a temple scribe to write his name into a prayer scroll meant for someone else's wife. When her husband discovered the charm beneath their bed, chaos followed. Accusations, demotions, silent withdrawals at court dinners. The woman never spoke publicly, but she never returned the scroll either. So now, You lie in your imagined bed, wondering, have you ever wanted someone badly enough to send a message they wouldn't see with their eyes? Would you write their name into flame, stitch it into fabric, whisper it into their sleep? The Tang did. And even when it failed, even when it backfired, even when it doomed them, they never stopped believing that love was bigger than words, bigger than presence. That maybe, just maybe, it could be caught, carried, controlled, whether it worked or not. That's a different spell entirely. You pass through the temple gates just before midnight. The stone floor is cool beneath your feet, the air heavy with sandalwood and quiet thunder. But the silence here isn't empty, it hums. And it pulls you toward the inner courtyard where lanterns swing lazily in the breeze, casting gold patterns across stone Buddha faces that have seen far more than they'll ever admit. You think you're in a place of chastity, peace, detachment, but then you hear it low rhythmic chanting, not just devotional. It has a lilt, a cadence. You step closer, and there it is, a monk reciting poetry, erotic poetry. Not lascivious, not explicit but undeniably tender. Longing pressed into meter. Words meant not to excite, but to evoke. Welcome to the strangest contradiction of Tang pillow talk. The celibate who sings of sex. In Tang China, Buddhist monks were often revered for their wisdom and restraint. But some of them were also the most exquisite lovers on paper. You see, these weren't monks born into the temple. Many had lived wild lives before donning the robe. Courtiers, artists, former courtesans. Some chose monastic silence after heartbreak. Others were ordered into temples after political disgrace. And while their mouths vowed silence and abstinence, their pens never quite got the memo. They wrote poems about the softness of skin they could no longer touch, about the smell of a lover's breath before confession, about waking in the night to the ghost of a voice they swore they'd forgotten. And these weren't hidden scribbles. Some were exchanged with other monks. Some were even read aloud during evening gatherings, under the gentle pretext of examining the temptations of worldly life. Historians still argue whether these verses were personal confessions, metaphors for divine union, or coded messages to actual lovers on the outside. One scroll, recovered from a mountain temple, reads, "I shaved my head, but not my memory. Your laugh still echoes in my breath." That's not theology. That's grief. But not all monks were tormented romantics. Some embraced sensuality as a bridge to enlightenment. Certain sects, influenced by tantric traditions from India, believed in the union of opposites, masculine and feminine, physical and spiritual, sacred and profane. They wrote about bodies not as temptation, but as scripture. A soft back was a sutra. A kiss, a kind of bow. One monk poet even compared pillow talk to mantra chanting, repetition that transforms the speaker, revealing layers with each breath. That line stayed with me. She said my name like prayer, I answered like echo. Let's wander into tonight's peculiar truth. One preserved monk's robe, tucked away in a dry cave in Dunhuang, was discovered to have hidden calligraphy inked into the inner lining. Not scripture, not philosophy, but a single sentence. If I reach nirvana first, I'll wait for you. Who wrote it? For whom? We'll never know. But someone wore those words on their skin, every day, in silence. Of course, not everyone approved. Many monks who expressed such sentiments faced accusations of corruption. Some were defrocked. A few vanished entirely, their temples restructured, or their poetry burned. But the verses survived, copied in secret, whispered among students. Because for some, those words held more comfort than doctrine. They proved that longing wasn't weakness, it was proof of feeling. And feeling, in Tang thought, was still a path to truth, even if it wasn't the approved one. But let's not forget the women. Buddhist nuns, too, wrote verses about the body, about love, about the ache of choosing solitude over closeness. One anonymous verse found in a monastic collection reads, "I turned from his hands and faced the wall, but the wall grew warm." That's one sentence, but it says everything about restraint, about memory, about the stubborn persistence of intimacy. And it wasn't always forbiddance. In some circles, these poems were appreciated as art. Emotional discipline turned into language. Scholars collected them. Emperors read them aloud. One empress is said to have had a favorite monk poet whose lines were so moving she refused to punish him despite his past affair with one of her cousins. She reportedly said, "Let him speak. His regret teaches more than his silence ever could." So tonight, as you curl into your own pillow, celibate or not, think about the people who gave up touch but not tenderness, who spoke through poetry because they were no longer allowed to whisper, who made every word count because it was the only form of intimacy left. And ask yourself, what would you say if you could say only one thing, once, to someone who once held your heart? Because in the Tang temples, sometimes that's all you got. One moment, one verse, and a lifetime to chant its echo. You lie still, eyes closed, and at first it seems like nothing's happening. No conversation, no movement, just two people breathing in the dark. But then something shifts. The air grows warmer, not from touch, but from attention. One breath lengthens, another shortens. A quiet hum rises between them, not words, not even sighs, just presence. This is not foreplay. This is not postcoital chatter. This is the forgotten middle ground of intimacy, listening. And in the Tang Dynasty, it wasn't optional. It was the entire point. You see, the Tang didn't worship volume. They worshipped response. What mattered wasn't how loud you spoke, but how deeply you heard. And not just with your ears, with your chest, your blood, your intuition. Pillow talk wasn't a performance, it was a duet. And the most skilled lovers weren't the most poetic. They were the most attuned. They knew how to wait, to leave silence where something might grow, to hear the tremor in a sentence and not interrupt it with solutions. This wasn't therapy. This was foreknowledge, a kind of emotional clairvoyance, developed not through technique but trust. One Tang poet wrote, "She spoke of plum blossoms, and I heard her mother's absence." Another confessed, "He said he missed spring, but I knew it was youth he mourned." These aren't just pretty metaphors. These are micro-miracles of recognition. Pillow talk at its most powerful didn't just soothe, it revealed. And revelation was risky, because once someone sees you, truly sees you, you can't unbe that vulnerable. That's why the best listeners in the Tang were both loved and feared, because they remembered everything, not just your words, but the spaces between them. Let's get specific. Lovers in this era didn't just murmur compliments, they mirrored. If someone spoke with hesitation, you slowed your breath. If their voice quivered, you lowered yours. You offered safety not by fixing their fear but by holding it. And if that sounds too modern, too therapeutic, consider this. Taoist texts from the period describe the ideal lover not as a giver or a taker, but as an echo. Someone who received your sound and returned it, softened, sharpened. True, this wasn't a purely emotional game either. Physical listening mattered. Where your fingers rested, when they moved, when they didn't. Some couples trained in what might now be called sensory patience, the ability to lie in stillness, tuned entirely to the pulse of the other person. It wasn't about control. It was about calibration. The Tang understood that stillness was a form of speech. That anticipation was the oldest language. Tonight's quirky but true detail. Some lovers used listening bowls, delicate ceramic dishes filled with water, and petals placed beside the bed. The idea was to track emotional tension through vibration. If your voice made the petals shiver, you were speaking too loudly. If they floated undisturbed, the moment was right. It was a literal measure of subtlety, an aesthetic check-in. And yes, some took it too seriously. One emperor reportedly ended a romance because a single night of conversation caused ripples. She moved the lily, he wrote in his journal, but not my heart. And yet, despite all this delicacy, real listening was messy, vulnerable. It required unlearning. You had to forget your cleverness, drop your scripts, pay attention to the moment, not the outcome. That's why so few could do it well, and why those who could were unforgettable. Their names may not appear in the official scrolls, but they're immortal in verses. He heard me before I knew what I was saying, one poem reads, and I have never felt more naked. Historians still debate whether this level of emotional literacy was widespread or idealized, but the remnants are undeniable. Letters filled with hesitation, poems wrapped in questions, records of lovers who sat together for hours saying nothing and left changed. The Tang believed that language was only one instrument in the orchestra of intimacy, and often not the most important. Breath mattered, weight, timing, and most of all, the willingness to wait for what someone was trying to say, even if they hadn't quite found the words. So tonight, try it. Just once. Turn off the lights. Close your eyes. Lie beside someone, or imagine lying beside them, and listen, not to the noise, but to what lingers underneath it. The hesitations, the almost statements, the nervous laughter, the shallow inhale before a truth. And ask yourself, do I know this person, or just their words? Because the Tang knew the secret you've always suspected. Love doesn't begin with what you say. It begins with how you listen when nothing's being said at all. You're sitting on the edge of a bed now, cold, perfectly made, untouched. The warmth is gone. So is the voice that used to meet yours in the dark. All that's left is paper. Piles of it. Folded letters, erased poems, official court records stamped with red ink and regret. You're not reading love notes anymore. You're reading evidence. Welcome to the bureaucratic graveyard of intimacy, where postcoital confessions become administrative nightmares, and the end of pillow talk leads not to heartbreak, but to paperwork. Because in the Tang Dynasty, lovers didn't just break up. They left trails, and those trails could end in exile, scandal, or worse, a silence loud enough to echo through generations. You might think this part of the story would be sad, and you'd be right, but it's also voyeuristically addictive. Because nothing reveals the truth of someone quite like what they write after they've lost what mattered most. Here, in the Imperial Archives, the words are no longer wrapped in silk or incense. They're dry, official, brutal, dismissed for excessive familiarity, transferred for personal impropriety, voluntary relocation following intimate entanglement with a court-affiliated musician. Every phrase a euphemism, every euphemism a story. These weren't mere breakups. These were public collapses of private conversations, whispers that backfired so spectacularly they were carved into the walls of bureaucratic history. One record tells of a woman named Li Wuyu, a tea servant who shared her bed and her secrets with a junior official. For months, she listened to him whisper complaints about his superior, his ambitions, his brilliant plans to restructure grain distribution in his home province. He never imagined those thoughts would leave the room. But when she was suddenly dismissed from her post, she retaliated not with fury, but with transcription. She copied down everything he'd said, by hand, in perfect calligraphy, delivered it to the superior in question. He was arrested within the week. She disappeared. Some say she became a nun. Others say she was hired by a rival family to continue doing what she clearly excelled at, remembering. Historians still argue whether she acted out of revenge or simply survival. But her name shows up again, decades later, in a footnote on military scroll, cited as an early example of domestic intelligence gathering. Think about that. A woman known not for beauty or scandal, but for listening so well, it changed history. And it didn't stop with breakups. Some lovers were so intertwined with their partner's political decisions that the collapse of their relationship caused national instability. One notorious general reportedly refused to deploy troops until a palace dancer agreed to see him. Again, his hesitation caused a delay that cost the empire 2 cities. His lover? Reassigned to a distant province. His name? Scrubbed from court praise poems. But the dancer's name remained, whispered, with awe and fear, in the barracks. Now, your odd but true tidbit for the night. Tang couples, especially high-ranking ones, sometimes drafted pre-intimacy agreements. Not marriage contracts. Pillow. Agreements. These documents outlined what could and couldn't be discussed in bed. No mention of court officials, one clause read. No recollection of prior lovers, read another. One particularly strict agreement banned all political metaphors during intimacy, no cranes flying west, no metaphors involving falling dynasties or wilting bamboo. Why? Because metaphors got people killed. And once spoken, even in pleasure, they had a way of resurfacing twisted, misquoted, weaponized, and when things ended, people wrote, obsessively. One poet composed a 100-line elegy for a former lover who leaked his verses to a rival. Each stanza begins with the phrase, "I should not have said," followed by increasingly specific regrets. "I should not have said you reminded me of my mother. I should not have said I could read your face like a map. I should not have said I could die if you asked." That last one? He almost did. The Tang didn't believe in closure. They believed in echo, in letting silence spread like spilled ink. Some breakups weren't even spoken aloud. A robe folded differently, a brush returned, a pillow left cold 3 nights in a row. That was enough. The message landed, but the confusion? That stayed forever. So now, as you curl into your own bed, maybe with a phone buzzing too close to your heart, ask yourself, what would your pillow talk look like if someone wrote it down? Would it make you blush? Laugh? Be proud? Or would it haunt you, line by line, in the margins of a future you didn't see coming? Because in the Tang, nothing whispered ever truly disappeared. It just changed shape, became a file, a footnote, a verse, or worse, a line no one forgot, long after the pillow grew cold. You roll over and your head lands not on feathers or cotton, but on something hard, cool, and faintly humming with history. A Tang pillow. And no, it's not a joke, it's real. A glazed ceramic arc designed not for comfort, but for posture. For poise, for clarity of voice, for discipline of breath. You shift, expecting softness, but the pillow offers none. Only structure. A cradle for the neck. A perch for the skull. A platform for everything that might leave your lips in the dark. Because in the Tang Dynasty, the shape of your pillow wasn't incidental. It was part of the architecture of intimacy. It controlled how close you lay, how clearly you heard, how carefully you spoke. It turned your bedroom into a stage and your whispers into rituals. You see, the Tang didn't treat sleep as an escape. They treated it as a state of heightened receptivity, which meant the pillow wasn't just where your head rested. It was where your secrets were released. And if that sounds poetic, that's because it was some ceramic pillows were literally inscribed with verses. Speak only what you can carry into the next life, one reads. Another says, if your words become dreams, make them gentle. These weren't mass-produced slogans. They were hand-painted by artisans who understood that a pillow could be sacred or dangerous. The typical design. A concave arc, wide enough for the neck, with just enough elevation to keep the throat open. This wasn't accidental. The Tang believed your voice was connected to your spirit. That breath and what wrote upon it was the bridge between desire and destiny. So yes, a pillow could shape the tone of your intimacy, could force you to lie slightly apart, creating a space where sound moved cleanly from mouth to ear, could amplify the hush of confession, The hush of almost saying it. Historians still argue whether these pillows were used in all households or reserved for the elite, but they've been found everywhere, from tombs to scholar studios to pleasure chambers. One even had a tiny compartment inside, likely for storing keepsakes, herbs, or, as one theory suggests, love letters that couldn't be left in the open. Imagine that, resting your head on the very words you're afraid to say aloud. And the symbolism went further. The materials mattered: porcelain for clarity, jade for protection, lacquered wood for warmth. One empress famously slept on a rose quartz pillow, believing it would cool jealous thoughts. Did it work? Not exactly. Her rival disappeared within the year. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a culture where symbolism breathed alongside ritual, the pillow was never just a pillow. It was an altar, an oracle, a confidant. Here's your weird detail for tonight. Some lovers in the Tang actually gave pillow portraits as gifts. Tiny ceramic sculptures shaped like pillows but engraved with their face, their favorite poem, even their scent rubbed into the glaze with fragrant oils before firing. These weren't to be slept on, necessarily. They were to be kept, tucked, beneath actual pillows, so that even in absence, the breath of the absent lover would linger close to the skin. But not every pillow carried love. Some were shaped like beasts, lions, tigers, bats, not for aesthetics, but protection, to frighten off bad dreams, to anchor a vulnerable sleeper during travel. One particular example, found in the ruins of a frontier station, bore a single inscription: "Let no false tongue find me." That wasn't about nightmares. That was about betrayal. Someone, somewhere, had learned the hard way that what you say in bed doesn't always stay there. The Tang even had a word for the emotional weight left behind after shared sleep: yimeng, or dream residue. It referred not to literal dreams, but to the impressions lovers left on each other through overnight conversation, a glance exchanged before sleep, a sentence murmured too late to retract. The imprint of vulnerability. Pillow talk wasn't ephemeral. It lingered, pressed into the ceramic, into the air, into the skin. And the pillow, hard, unyielding, unsentimental, was the only witness that never forgot. So tonight, as you lie in your soft modern bed, ask yourself, what has your pillow heard? If it could speak, what would it say back? Would it hold your confessions kindly? Or would it remind you of the things you said when you thought no one was really listening? Because in the Tang Dynasty, they were always listening. And the pillow? It was listening too. You find yourself in a room that feels oddly too quiet, like someone has just left and taken the laughter with them. The cushions are still dented, the perfume hasn't faded. But there's no voice, no breath, just stillness. This is not the golden era of Chang'an. This is the aftermath. The late Tang, the silk is fraying. The poetry has gone political. And the pillow talk? It still exists, but now it echoes through empty halls, spoken by ghosts who don't realize they've been forgotten. You're lying in the last nights of a dynasty, and the whispers haven't stopped. They've just become memory. By now, the court is bloated with intrigue. Eunuchs rule the palace. The emperors are shadows of their ancestors. And the bed, once a space of dangerous honesty, is now a stage for rehearsed loyalty. People still whisper after lovemaking, but it's more careful now, tighter. You say what you're supposed to say. You ask about a poem or a dream, but you no longer expect the truth. Lovers listen for traps, not secrets. And the quiet isn't intimate anymore. It's self-defense. But even here, in decline, something beautiful lingers. A single line of poetry written in water on a stone floor, evaporating before it can be read. A courtesan braiding her hair alone, still humming the melody of a song, once sung into her ear by a prince who no longer remembers her name. A scholar writing letters addressed to no one, folded and sealed and burned in a brazier before dawn. Because even if love can't save a crumbling empire, people still try. They still hope. They still talk in the dark, wondering if someone might answer. One of the last surviving pillow books from the Tang period ends not with advice, but with a question. If the dynasty falls and we are dust, will our words still stir the air? It's painfully self-aware, and maybe too romantic. But it touches something that feels familiar. Because by now, you've spent this entire night chasing the fragments of whispers. And whether those fragments belong to emperors, poets, courtesans, monks, or spies, they all wanted the same thing, to be heard. Even once, even briefly. Even when history forgets the speaker. There's one final story I'll leave you with. It's simple. A widow, nameless in the record, was known in her village for reciting a single poem every night before bed. Her neighbors assumed it was religious. But after her death, they found a slip of paper beneath her pillow, tattered, almost illegible. It contained a single verse. I never spoke the thing I meant to say, but I said it, somehow, in sleep. No attribution. No reply. Just her voice, folded in silence. And that perhaps is the truth of all pillow talk. It's never really about what you say. It's about what you mean. It's about the moment when language fails and you try anyway, because to stay silent feels worse. Because you believe, irrationally, bravely, that the person next to you might just understand that. So now, you lie back, the story complete, your breath slowing as the last voices of Chang'an fade. The city is gone. The walls have crumbled, the brocade rotted, the poems scattered. But the conversations? The ones spoken just before sleep, in half-formed words and long pauses, they linger, in the air, in the pillows. Maybe even in you. Let it go now. The intrigue, the weight, the longings that don't belong to you. Imagine the silk curtains pulling. Closed, slow, and soundless. Feel the candle flicker once, then vanish. There's no need to speak, no need to explain. Just breathe, deep and steady, like someone once taught you with a fan and a glance. Let your body soften into the mattress. Let your mind dissolve into stillness. You are no longer in Chang'an. You are no longer waiting for an answer. There is no question now, only quiet, only rest. The kind that cradles you, not because you said the right thing, but because you dared to say anything at all. Sleep well, my friend. The words will end of script. Sweet dreams.